everyone for being here. Good morning. We are super excited for this event. Of course, my name is Heather. I have the pleasure of working for Portland Farmers Market and facilitating this event. And before we get going with our demonstration, I just wanted to shout out to some of the wonderful folks who are fermenting products and selling them here in the market. Gentle Rain Farm is right behind you. Sue's hoping she'll be able to hear the demo from her booth. Made a beautiful leek kraut and brings that to the market regularly. We'll have it through the winter. Gee Creek also has a number of different krauts and sauerkrauts that they sell and kimchis that they sell year-round. Gathering Together Farm. This has been my favorite so far, but there are plenty to try. They've got a purple ginger kraut. Gathering Together, one of our mainstay farmers markets, growing down in the Willamette Valley and fermenting what they grow on their farm. And will be here with us year-round through the winter. We're here every Saturday. We're just closed on December 25th and January 1st this year because they fall on holidays. Choice Kimchi. Super excited to have had them celebrate their 10th anniversary season with us in the market this year. And we started their business so that they could sell it here at Portland Farmers Market, so that they could share their traditional kimchi recipe with all of us, and we're oh so lucky that they decided to do that. They'll be back in the springtime. They take the winter off, but we'll see them again in the spring. And the Fermentista doing hyper-local or hyper-seasonal, and of course all of these are local ingredients and ferments. And so today I grabbed this spicy sauerkraut, but there's a spicy radish that I've got my eye on over there. It looks absolutely wonderful. And something really cool and special that we have in the market, we've got a soy-free tempeh vendor. If you aren't familiar with squirrel and crow, they've got some incredible flavors, including the chickpea quinoa, and they recently started doing market specials. So each week there's a different, like today it's ribs. They've got marinated tempeh that's just ready to pop in the oven. So I wanted to mention those folks, and you'll find lots of wonderful things here at the farmers market, but these are some of our fermenters that are bringing their goods year-round, and we're so lucky to have them. And with that being said, I'm going to stop talking and pass the mic over to the wonderful Liz Crain. Thank you for being here, hosting Sandor Katz for Chef in the Market.
Thank you, Heather. Welcome, everyone. It's so good to be here. Hope you're bundled up. Sandor, how are you doing?
I'm doing good.
Yeah. And today we're going to be talking about Poutsai, which is in your book, Fermentation Journeys. And this, you traveled with it.
I did. I didn't travel with it in this. Like my travel setup is I use one of those plastic gallon-size olive barrels that have a tight lid on them. So, like, I flew with that, and then my first stop was, my sister lives in Bend, and when I was at my sister's house, I was like, do you happen to have a big jar that I could borrow? And
yeah.
So I got this.
You got it.
But I wouldn't dare put this just like cushioned in my luggage.
Those lids say leak-proof, but they're not really leak-proof. I just want to quickly just say, Sandor is my food hero, and I got his copy of Wild Fermentation in 2003 when it came out, and then several years later got to go and travel and interview him for the Sun magazine, visit with him in Tennessee, and then started a fermentation festival here, the Portland Fermentation Festival. So that's the connection. But other than that, I'm just here to be your helper.
Okay.
And you just talk about the book, and yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, Liz. Thank you, Heather. Thank you all for coming out on this chilly, overcast morning. So over the course of the next 45 minutes or so, I'll show you how to make Poutsai, which is this Chinese style of pickles featuring a perpetual brine that you can just keep on reusing. But I want to just contextualize that a little bit. So anyway, I mean, for the last 20 years, I've been, mostly teaching people how to make sauerkraut and lots of other kinds of fermented foods and beverages. And, I mean, basically there's nothing we could possibly eat that cannot be fermented. What microbiology has illuminated for us is that, all of the plants and all of the animal products that make up our food are populated by elaborate communities of microorganisms. And, there's a certain inevitability to microbial transformation of our food. And, in different culinary traditions around the world, people have worked out different ways of, working with this invisible life force on our food so that rather than causing our food to decompose, it does different things that give us practical benefits. It produces alcohol, it stabilizes and preserves certain foods so we can eat them over longer periods of time. It makes certain foods more easily digestible. Certain foods have toxic compounds that fermentation can break down and remove. Of course, fermentation creates extraordinary flavors. So there's and of course today many people are getting interested in fermentation because of the potential of probiotics. So there's a range of different practical benefits to fermentation, and I think it's important to say that fermentation is not a unified set of practices. Fermentation is an extremely disparate set of practices. Really. Mostly depending on what kinds of food resources have historically been abundant in different parts of the world. What's the climate like? What kinds of organisms can you easily get to grow? And of course, today, we with greater possibilities of temperature and humidity control, you can make almost anything almost everywhere, and there's a growing market for starter cultures. So you can get starter cultures that are used in different parts of the world. But this notion of pure culture starters, a little packet of yeast, Aspergillus oryzae for starting koji, all these sort of pure culture starters. These are inventions of the 20th century, and while they can be wonderful and they can certainly expand our fermentation horizons, the vast majority of traditional fermentation processes around the world rely on organisms that are simply present on the food. And really the title of my first book about fermentation was Wild Fermentation, and Wild Fermentation describes precisely that. Fermentations that rely for the organisms of fermentation on the food ingredients themselves rather than some added something. So, in my first book, Wild Fermentation, and then my second book about fermentation was The Art of Fermentation, there's lots of practical information, but I've had just amazing opportunities to travel, and at this point I've taught about fermentation in about 25 different countries, and had opportunities to learn about foods and beverages in the places that I visited, and I've been taking photographs and taking notes and trying to recreate things I tasted when I was at home. And then this new book is really about foods and beverages that I've encountered in my travels. And China was a place that held a special appeal to me because once I started writing about fermentation, and sauerkraut was very much my gateway into fermentation. But all of the historical stories I've ever encountered repeat the same story, which is that the idea of sauerkraut came from China via the nomadic peoples of Central Asia, who sort of observed Chinese methods of fermenting vegetables under a brine and sort of brought that idea westward with them. And I've spent a total of 2 weeks in China. I can hardly claim any kind of expertise in Chinese cuisine, but it was very easy to find a wide variety of pickles in China, and pretty much everybody's house that we visited had homemade pickles to share, and people were excited to, share their recipes. And, like everywhere else, there's not like a unified way that everybody does it. There's a lot of, individuality and creative expression in, what kinds of seasoning combinations people use, what kinds of vegetables people use, how much salt people use, how long people ferment things, all those wonderful variables of fermentation that, make your pickles different from your friend's pickles. I want to talk for a minute about the word pickle, because pickle sometimes confuses people. And I've sometimes heard people say oh, I fermented those, I didn't pickle those, as if like pickling and fermentation were two completely separate notions. They're not exactly the same, but they're very much like overlapping. If we made a Venn diagram, they would be sort of circles that overlapped. So fermentation is the transformative action of microorganisms. That can include pickles. I mean, I grew up in New York City eating what in New York we call sour pickles, that are just basically cucumbers fermented in a brine with garlic and dill, maybe chili peppers, maybe some grape leaves to keep them crispy, but there's no vinegar added to it, and that's still a pickle. People get confused because if you walk into a contemporary, American supermarket and look on the pickle shelf, most of what you're going to find are, vegetables, or sometimes eggs, or sometimes pig's feet, or, various delicacies preserved under a vinegar solution. So what defines a pickle is it's anything preserved by acidity, and there's different ways of getting there. And one way is fermentation. Sauerkraut is a pickle. You just shred your vegetables, salt them, maybe squeeze them and pound them to get them a little bit juicy, pack them into a jar or a crock, and then, a week, 2 weeks, a month, 6 months later, you dig it out, and it is significantly soured from the activity of lactic acid bacteria consuming carbohydrates and producing lactic acid. If you take cucumbers or carrots or daikon or anything, and you pour a hot vinegar solution over it, you're doing the same thing. You're preserving the vegetables under acidity, and the acidity was derived from fermentation at some point. But generally, you're heating up the vinegar to pour it over it. And so even if you made, homemade vinegar, you're kind of, pasteurizing it. You're killing all the organisms in it before you pour it over the vegetables. And there are certain advantages to vinegar pickling, and that's why they can sit on the shelf in the supermarket indefinitely. But there's also certain disadvantages. Like, personally, I vastly prefer the flavor of lactic acid pickles. And, whatever you might lose in terms of long-term shelf stability, you more than gain in, flavor, freshness, and probiotics. The downside is it's just a little bit more dynamic because of the living bacteria in it. As I understand it, vinegar pickling really only became popular outside of the traditional wine-making regions of the world, where vinegar's always been abundant because it is a, consolation prize byproduct of, winemaking that gets exposed to too much oxygen. But outside of these regions of the world, older pickling traditions all involve lactic acid bacteria and fermentation. And it's really only in the middle of the 20th century when, those gallons of vinegar that are cheaper than water at the supermarket, distilled white vinegar, that's what propelled vinegar pickles into the forefront, was the technology to do that. So anyway, I've never met a pickle I didn't like. I've nothing against vinegar pickles, but, I just prefer the taste of lactic acid pickles, and, I'm really interested in the probiotics of them, and that's what I like to eat, and that's what I like to share with people. But there's a lot of different ways to do it. And, the thing that was most interesting to me in China, whenever I've made sour pickles, I make a fresh brine. I mix up a salt solution. I usually put grape leaves in because the tannins in the grape leaves help keep the pickles crunchy. I scrape off the residue of the blossom end of each cucumber because the blossom end has the most concentration of those enzymes that can make your pickles get soft and mushy. Have any of you ever had soft and mushy pickles? I mean, cucumbers are the hardest vegetable to ferment. Because cucumbers have such a concentration of these enzymes, and because they're ripe at the hottest time of the year, as opposed to things like daikons and things like cabbages, which tend to be harvested after the summer heat cools down a little bit. So when you ferment something that's ready in the heat of the year, it's fermenting in the heat of the year, and in that heat, these enzymes that can make the vegetables get really soft and mushy get super active. So anyway, but I mix up a fresh brine each time I make pickles. But I was really struck in China that I met a handful of people who have these perpetual brines going in a crock in their kitchen, and they just keep on putting vegetables in and taking vegetables out. And it's not that you never touch the brine, because you have to, because every time you put vegetables in and pull them out, you end up taking some of the salt with it, and you end up taking some of the flavor of the seasoning. So I don't know any systematic way to do that, except like I keep on tasting the brine, and with every generation of fresh vegetables that I put in, I'll just taste the brine, and I'll just decide like, oh, this needs a little bit more salt to maintain a fairly consistent salt content. The chili flavor is really dissipating, why don't I put some fresh chilies in? But I just started with a fresh brine, and so Heather prepared this brine. So this is water that has a couple of teaspoons of salt and a couple of teaspoons of a specific kind of sugar. So I mean, the sugar that I saw people using in China was a very specific sugar. It was called Ding Ding Tang, and it looks like Turkish taffy. It's a malt sugar. And I've never been able to find it except like, this one street vendor in China. We bought a chunk of it. I brought it home. That's long gone. That was 5 years ago. But this is maltose that you can buy, in many Asian markets. I don't know exactly where Heather got this, but from, some Asian market around Portland. It's pretty easy to find, or through the internet. But honestly, you can use no sugar at all. I met one Chinese couple that just wasn't using sugar. The sugar doesn't make it sweet. The sugar just kickstarts the fermentation. It just gives a more concentrated carbohydrate, so you get a faster, more dramatic acid production quickly. Or you can just use cane sugar or honey, or whatever kind of sugar you have around your place. Like there's like no step in this process is mandatory. This is all about finding the methods that you like to do it. So I usually use a little bit of this malt sugar and a little bit of salt. I heard Liz say she added more salt to hers. You just got to taste it and just think about how it tastes to you, because people have such different palates for salt. So you start with some salt and some maltose. Certainly if you use maltose, you'll want to use hot water. I would recommend, if you're using water out of a municipal tap, that you use hot water anyway. Bring it to a boil, dissolve everything in it, let it cool down. I mean, I live with a spring. I usually don't boil the water, but I'll boil a little bit so I can dissolve the maltose. And then it's about seasoning. And I saw like a lot of different, ways that people season things, season these kinds of pickles. So, okay, we're gonna use a few just dried chilies. We're gonna take a few slices of ginger.
And I just used regular cane sugar in mine too. I didn't have this. Is this sort of thick?
Yeah. Here,
kind
so
of
here
a
we
thick,
can.
pasty.
Yeah, this is very, very gluey. I mean, when I've put it in cold water, I mean, eventually it will dissolve, but it'll take some time.
Yeah.
Because it's just like this sort of gummy. Okay. So here we can pretty much hold it upside down. It's very, very thick.
Yeah.
A couple of teaspoons. So this is about a quart of water, and a couple of teaspoons. none of this is rocket science. If anyone ever tries to represent to you that, to make sauerkraut you need 2.25% salt, otherwise, like, you might kill somebody, just ignore them. Salt does some important things, but there's definitely traditions where people use no salt, and it doesn't, salt is not absolutely essential to make it safe. Like, salt is more important to, like, maintain a firm texture for the vegetables. And really to slow down the process a little bit, because when your objective is preservation, a slower transformation is actually better than a faster transformation. So, but salt and sugar really to taste. But bear in mind, it's not going to stay sweet if you use the sugar. The purpose of the sugar is to sort of supercharge it and get a more rapid acidification. So I'm going to use let's say a tablespoon of these Sichuan peppercorns. If you've never tried these, they have a beautiful flavor. It's a really, like, slightly numbing flavor. This is something that I learned about in China, and it's used in Chinese cuisine and also Indian cuisine. It's called black cardamom. Very different from the green pods of cardamom that are more common. Has a beautiful kind of pungent, savory flavor. We'll go ahead and put a piece of star anise in there, and then I've been putting licorice in. It's so funny. I just, like, without looking at my notes from this woman we visited in Chengdu, I just started making it and putting licorice in it, and then I told my friend Mara, who I had gone on the trip with, and she was like, I don't think Mrs. Ding was using licorice. I don't know where you got that idea. And then I looked back in my notes, and there was no mention of licorice, but it's so good that I just keep doing it. Whatever kinds of seasonings you like, there's no sort of standard recipe. And you can see from so this is the one that I made and brought. This is the one that Liz made, and these are ones that Heather made. So, you're going to get to taste all three of them. So you'll just be able to see that, all three of us, kind of interpreted it a little bit differently. And then you just put veggies in, and it really, whatever veggies you have in abundance. I mean, generally what I like to do is, like, rather than putting in a ton of bite-sized pieces, I'll typically put, like, fewer larger pieces just for ease of pulling them out. Just so I'm not, like, hunting for all these tiny little pieces. But I would say that, let's say you're, having a dinner party in 2 days and you want it to go faster, well then, cut it into smaller pieces so, there's less distance from the surface to the center of each piece, and the flavors and the fermentation can penetrate more deeply, more quickly. And then basically you just fill this up with vegetables. Now the first batch, if you start a batch of this at home, expect the first batch to take probably 2 weeks to get nice and sour, for the flavors to be fully melded. But then once you build up a critical mass of lactic acid bacteria and lactic acid, then each batch will go faster. And actually, like on this little book tour, one day I did it 2 days in a row. I did demos, and one day I served the ones that had been in there for a week. And then I put some more vegetables in, tried to make smaller pieces, and the next day I served them, and they were, like, just beautifully pickled after 1 day. So, once it matures, you can use it, in a much shorter term kind of a way. So that's the basics. This book is full of different foods and beverages that I've learned about. They're not all pickles. Originally I started the project thinking that I would organize it geographically and say, oh, this is my trip to China, and these are some things I learned about, and this was my trip to Colombia, and these are some things that I learned about. But I ended up deciding to sort of organize it thematically, so it's sort of by type of substrate. So there's a chapter about vegetable fermentations, there's a chapter about grain fermentations, there's a chapter about meat and fish fermentations, there's a chapter about bean fermentations, there's a chapter about simple sugars and mostly beverages that you can make from simple sugars. So so anyway, I'm happy to answer questions about Pao Tsai or other things in the book, or the mold on your kombucha, or the texture of your sauerkraut, or anything. I'm okay. Great.
How far apart do you see keep your fermentation projects? A couple of years ago, I had a keeper going, I had mead, and I had kombucha. And my SCOBY got black. The mead was amazing, but I learned a hard lesson.
Could everyone hear that? So she's asking, she has all these different ferments that she's been making at home, and how far do you keep them apart so that they don't sort of play with each other, and the mold from this doesn't move to the yeast to that?
I mean, personally, I don't worry about it at all. I don't worry about it at all. And early in my fermentation journey, I met this woman, Betty Steckmeyer, who lived in Fort Bragg, California. And Betty and her husband Gordon in the 70s started the first business in the U.S. that was really catering to home fermenters. It was called Gem Cultures. Betty and Gordon have both passed on, but Betty's daughter runs the business out of Washington State. But Betty, the whole time, she was propagating tempeh spores. She was propagating kombucha mothers. She was propagating kefir grains, water kefir grains, like all these different things. And she had a 12-foot square commercial kitchen that she made in her basement, where she did all of it. And she said that in 30 years of doing that, she doesn't believe she ever experienced any cross-contamination. So, I mean, I think that if you're working with pure culture fungal starters, let's say you're trying to make tempeh starter or koji starter, I think that when you're trying to make something pure like that, that's very much like you're fighting nature. If you're trying to like isolate a singular organism and propagate it, then you would really want to isolate more strenuously. But if you're not doing that, I mean, all these, most of the things I ever work with are these mixed cultures that, I mean, whatever other kind of food was around, fermenting vegetables isn't going to matter. The lactic acid bacteria are just always going to dominate. So, a lot of the, let's say, okay, if you're brewing and you're worried that your beer is going to turn into vinegar, that has more to do with protecting it from oxygen, because that you can presume that the acetobacter are present, and the only thing preventing them from eating up your alcohol and turning it into vinegar is lack of access to the oxygen that it needs to metabolize that. I mean, I don't want to tell you if you feel like you experienced cross-contamination. I mean, I don't want to say it's impossible, but I think that in most cases working with mixed cultures, it would be immaterial. It wouldn't really matter.
Yeah, I don't know what happened that week that month, but it was pretty happy.
I just want to add that all of these veggies, of course, are from farmer vendors. And so the daikon that Sandor has been chopping is from Groundwork Organics. And then the carrots are from Bethel Springs Farm. And then Napa cabbage is from Gathering Together Farm. So if after this you want to go and get these exact veggies at the market.
Anyone else have any questions about anything? Any fermentation related topics? That's hard to believe. Okay.
What should you watch out for? Like, what could go wrong? How do you
In fermenting vegetables specifically?
Just from a health perspective, a safety perspective.
Okay, so the main things that can go wrong are your veggies can get soft and mushy. That doesn't present a danger, except maybe an aesthetic danger. I mean, to me, a soft, mushy pickle is not at all appealing. But like, if you bite into one, you don't have to worry that you're going to get sick from it. Like, you just spit it out because it's got a gross texture, and put it in the compost and move on. And generally the cause of that is you did it in warm weather. Like I mean, I know I read about the intense heat wave that you all had this summer. You know, you could ferment vegetables at any temperature, but if you ferment vegetables and it's 105 degrees, you know, you can expect that your vegetables are going to get pretty soft and mushy, and that's a result of enzymes. And so the cooler the space that you ferment things, the crisper the vegetables will stay. Salt to some degree inhibits those enzymes, so the more salt you use, the crisper they can potentially stay. And then the other big problem people have, okay, how many of you have ever had some funky surface growth on your fermenting vegetables? And how many of you have ever fermented vegetables? Oh my God, it's the same people. So, I mean, it's just, like, unless you have some system that's very cleverly engineered, and there are more and more of these cleverly designed systems that exclude oxygen from the surface, then, I mean, you know, your whole, whether you're getting veggies under a brine like this, or whether you're salting cabbage and squeezing it or pounding it sauerkraut style, that's called dry salting because you're not adding any water typically, and you're just pulling juice out of the vegetables. But, you know, either way, most vegetable fermentation processes, the environment you're trying to create is getting the vegetables submerged under liquid, and this is specifically to protect them from the flow of oxygen in the air. The surface is the most vulnerable place because that's where, you know, the vegetables come into contact with oxygen, unless you have some special system to exclude oxygen. So, you know, typically, you know, most of my fermentation experience of sauerkraut has been in crocks, the cylindrical American-style crocks, and I just put like a plate that sits on the surface, and then usually a jug of water to function as a weight to press down, and then some sort of a cloth over. So often there's a little like rim around the edge, which is the place that gets exposed to oxygen. The plate in the center is protecting the veggies in the center from oxygen, but there's a little rim. And, you know, sometimes when I take the plate off and before I harvest some sauerkraut, I'll just take my clean hand and just run it around the edge and just lift off all that funky stuff and throw it into the compost. And it's just not a big deal. I mean, there are some people, especially online, who are saying that, like, oh, it's a terrible threat to your health if you have a little bit of, you know, funky growth, you know, you did it all wrong, you should throw it away. I don't know. I mean, that's really at odds with what I've seen around the world in communities that have had intimate connections with this. In China, in Sichuan province, we visited a town called Pijan, where they make this food called doubanjiang, which is this wonderful seasoning condiment that's fava beans fermented with chilies and salt. And then, you know, the factory was sort of affiliated with this huge restaurant which was showcasing doubanjiang. But when the chef of this 500-seat restaurant heard that we were interested in pickles and other kinds of ferments as well, he just took off his, you know, he just took off his apron and was like, "Follow me." And we went a couple of blocks away. He had this open-air pickle shack, you know, not unlike this, except that it was a permanent roof but no walls, and then all of these big ceramic potbelly vessels. And he wanted to show us his fermenting long beans, but none of them had markings on them. So, you know, he opened a half a dozen of these crocks, and, you know, pulled out like whole bok choy and you know, whole roots of ginger, and, you know, all kinds of things. But what was remarkable to me, and the long beans were lovely and wonderful, but what was really remarkable to me was we were there, you know, videotaping and taking photos, and every one of these vessels that he opened up had this like thick matrix of calm yeast, which is, you know, what most frequently the funk that you're most likely to encounter on the surface of your fermenting vegetables. And he just, without being at all self-conscious that we were videotaping, he just mixed it back in and didn't give it a thought. Like, it didn't even occur to him to feel awkwardly about it, because to him it's just such a like normal part of what happens. And and so harmless. Now, I mean, personally, I don't mix it in. I like to try to skim it off as best I can, and sometimes it's impossible to completely remove it. Some of it just dissipates into the brine, and you can't worry about it. Now, sometimes that calm yeast, which is, it's a name that covers a variety of different fungi that can grow on the surfaces exposed to oxygen, but sometimes that will kind of give way to a hairy mold. And I've seen this hundreds of times. Every single time I've ever seen it, it starts out as this white mold, and if you leave it to mature, then as it matures, it'll develop like gray and black patches, which are the sign of sporulation. As long as it stays in that monochromatic range, try not to worry about it. Just remove it. If it grows for a while, then you'll find that you'll have a top layer that's like discolored and gets like softer. Remove it as deeply as you need to get rid of that discolored layer. But once you go down an inch or so, it's going to be beautiful, bright color, and it's going to still be crisp and wonderful. But of course, the final arbiter has to be your, if you taste it and you think like, ooh, the whole thing just tastes like a little moldy, then throw it away. But that has not been my experience most of the time.
So if in the example where you're saying that if your pickle gets moldy and you're trying to reuse your brine, would you want to dump your brine at that point, or would it more likely be an issue with weather?
Yeah, sure. I mean, honestly, with cucumber pickles, I have not much reused brine. I certainly have met people who practice backslopping. Backslopping is when you take a little bit of the previous batch and add it into the next. So they'll mix up a fresh brine and then maybe take a cup of that mature brine and add it into there as a starter. But me personally, I would never do that. I would only backslop from a batch that I really liked, and I wouldn't backslop from something weirder, because it's going to have the enzymes in it already, and it might sort of start making the vegetables unnecessarily soft and mushy. And I've really stayed away from doing cucumbers in this. I don't think that there's any reason why you couldn't, but it's sort of out of a concern of getting too much of the enzymes in there. Mostly I've used more hearty, crispy vegetables. Celery, I've had great experiences with celery in this, cauliflower, all kinds of radishes, celeriac. And pieces of cabbage too. Often what I've done is taken a small head of cabbage, kept the core on it, and cut it into 8 or 16 little slices, each held together by the core, and put those in it.
Why is yours so pretty?
Oh, okay. Well, this bright pink color, that's because when I was at the Union Square Farmers Market in New York a couple of months ago, they gave me these beautiful purple daikons. And it turns out that the purple pigments in vegetables, that anthocyanins, react to acidity by turning bright pink. So it started out as like a bluer purple, but then the acidity made it hot pink, and of course the color, just absorbed into the brine. So maybe now forevermore I'll have bright pink vegetables from my outside.
I have a large batch of red miso going right now, and when it was about maybe 2 months old or 3 months old, I scooped off some tamari off the top, and it tasted really delicious. And then it kind of went through really interesting transformation in what you can speak to. So it first tasted very much like tamari, very floral. And then I went on a camping trip and took it with me, and it was supposed to heat for a couple of days. And it got quite sour, almost like a rice vinegar. And then I put it back on my shelf, and it sat for another month or so, and then it tasted quite sweet, almost like a rin almost.
Interesting.
I'll just repeat the question too. So asking about miso, homemade miso that's gone through all these different evolutions of really great and taking the tamari off. Yep.
The tamari on the top is what I'm asking about.
The tamari on the top was sweet and then sour, and then it's changing.
So when you make miso, the liquid that can rise to the top is called tamari. But at 2 months old, it's not very mature. So there's a lot of unfermented proteins and carbohydrates in it. So you can, if I set out to make soy sauce, I use very different proportions, and I do it for a very long time, at least a year. Like actually, I just harvested some soy sauce a couple of months ago, and it was a full 2 years. And I was really gauging it by the color. One of the things that I really just learned in the last few years is that a long-term fermentation can cause the Maillard effect, which is caramelization that we more typically associate with heat. Like if you caramelize onions or something like that. But the same thing can happen slowly over fermentation. And the dark color of soy sauce is a result of the sort of slow accumulation of the Maillard effect and until it gets dark, really dark. But anyway, if you harvested some tamari off of your miso at 2 months old, it still had a lot of unfermented nutrients. So it's very dynamic and very much a work in progress. So becoming more sour, that's not surprising at all to me. Like lactic acid bacteria and or acetic acid bacteria acting on the little bit of alcohol that's in there will make it more sour. In terms of it becoming less sour and more sweet, well, it turns out that acetobacter, one of the reasons why people seal vinegar so tightly is that acetobacter, the bacteria that metabolize alcohol into acetic acid in the presence of oxygen, if they run out of alcohol to consume but they still have oxygen, they can consume acetic acid and de-acidify it. And calm yeast and hairy molds can, if they're allowed to grow, de-acidify things. They can consume lactic acid. So I'm guessing that it was something like that made it get less acidic over time. And I guess what I'd recommend is if you harvest tamari after such a short time, harvest a limited amount that you'll use relatively quickly, or if you want to store it for any length of time, I would say in a small jar with as little air space as possible, and also, as if possible, in a refrigerator. And that'll sort of slow down all the, sort of ongoing dynamic changes.
I actually was really excited about the different stages. It all tasted really delicious.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything to be worried about. The worry with de-acidification of food is that, really, with pickles and other acidic ferments, the acidification is what makes them so intrinsically safe, because none of the organisms that are associated with food poisoning or illness can grow in an acidic environment, and so theoretically, if it de-acidifies too much, it could become more vulnerable. But I've never heard any stories of any problems. And actually, this guy I've become friendly with, who works for the USDA, the Agricultural Research Service of the USDA, according to their statistics, they have never found any documented cases of illness or food poisoning from fermented vegetables. Fermented vegetables are about as safe as food gets, and a fermented carrot would be much safer, statistically speaking, than me just eating this raw carrot. And we hear every year about people getting sick from raw vegetables. Usually it's some, freaky story of, manure from a factory farm washing down over a field of vegetables. It could just as well be sloppy handling, someone who failed to wash their hands at, some critical moment. But, if you took a vegetable that had been exposed to some potentially pathogenic bacteria and then you ferment it, the indigenous bacteria, the lactic acid bacteria that are on here will always dominate once you get them in a submerged environment. And as they acidify the environment, then whatever cells of salmonella or E. coli or whatever food poisoning organism might be present would be destroyed. So this is really a very effective strategy for food safety. And even though there are these sort of theoretical possibilities of de-acidification they're largely theoretical, and I haven't heard any, real life stories of people having problems from them.
I found that with some like spicy peppers that I fermented that have grown on yeast on top, they almost pick up like a winey quality. Is that because of that deacidification causing a different type of fermentation to go on than the lactic acid one?
Well, I mean, so there's always going to be traces of alcohol in fermented vegetables. And the sweeter the vegetables, the more potential for alcohol to accumulate. So, if you ferment beets, like that will be more alcoholic than if you ferment cabbages. But a sweeter cabbage will be more vulnerable to developing a little alcohol than a starchier cabbage. So, it just really depends on the vegetables. If it's in an open system with access to oxygen, you shouldn't get too much alcohol accumulation, because generally, if there's oxygen present, then acetobacter should be able to metabolize that alcohol into acetic acid. Then you'll have like a mix of lactic acid and acetic acid.
When you were talking about how heat gives you soft pickles, is that because, obviously if you ferment in a warmer room, it's going to be faster, or is that because vegetables in heat inherently produce more enzymes that break them down faster?
It's because the enzymes are more active at a higher temperature.
So if you have hot vegetables and then ferment them in a temperature controlled room, that negates that.
Yeah, exactly. So what I do, where I live in Tennessee, our typical, summertime days will get into the high 80s or low 90s. And so when I make cucumbers in the summertime, I make small batches. I definitely take time to examine every cucumber and scrape away any residue of the blossom on each one with a little paring knife. I use a big handful of grape leaves because the tannins on the grape leaves slow things down, and I only ferment at ambient temperature for like maybe 4 days. I watch them, and cucumbers, fresh cucumbers are a bright green color, and as they begin to acidify, they change to a duller, like olive green color. So as soon as I see the color change, I put it in the fridge, and I try to bury it in the back of the fridge and like leave it in there for like 2 more weeks. So you'll get like a slow, continued acidification, but the enzymes just can't, those enzymes that make vegetables soft and crispy, well, it's not that they can't function at all, but they function at just exceedingly slow rates in the fridge. I'm sure some of you have like had something that like got buried in the fridge for 6 months or a year, and then you pulled it out and it got a little soft and mushy. So that can happen even in the fridge, but it takes a really, really long time. So I'll do typically four days on the counter at ambient temperatures, and then in the fridge for another 2 weeks before I eat them. So, the ideal scenario would be if you had like a, 60 degree space or something. Oh, you could just like make the most beautiful crispy pickles that would like, last for months and months.
Is everyone liking the pao tsai, by the way? Isn't it good? Yeah.
Nice. Okay, in the back, blue jacket. Come a little closer and speak a little more loudly.
I tend to have this problem with my dry salted veggies like sauerkraut or like shredded carrots, where half of the time they just dry out. So like it gets really juicy the first day, and the second day, third day it gets juicier and juicier, and then maybe day 4 I come down and like all of the juices just disappear. And this happens like half the time, and I don't know what.
Okay, so first do you want to repeat the question?
Yeah, so just this gentleman was saying like it has these different salted, dry salted, fermented veggies that, day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4 are nice and juicy, and then all of the sudden, all of that liquid is greatly reduced and they're sort of dry. That's correct? Yeah.
Okay, the most important condition is to keep your vegetables submerged. And, if due to a dry climate, dry heat in your home, or, whatever reason, water disappears, add a little bit more water. Like, you want to keep the vegetables submerged. And, if you just add a cup of water, you're not going to be, like, diluting the flavor in a crazy way. So, probably it's evaporation. You know, it could also just be that water like kind of reabsorbs into. Are you using a weight of it? Okay, because I mean, if you don't weigh down your vegetables, like they'll always, you know, kind of reabsorb a lot of the excess moisture. So keeping them weighted is important. I mean, I can't tell you exactly why it's happening. I'm guessing it's some environmental thing, like, you know, heat or some other, you know, environmental dryness in the air, but the solution is simply to add some more water. And, you know, if the problem is that water has evaporated, you don't even need to add more salt, because, you know, the saltiness level was sort of, you know, based on, you know, something that was more watery, and if some of that water evaporates, you know, the salt is still there, so you can just add a little bit of water. When I say water, try to be mindful, like if you're living, you know, on municipal tap water, you know, either filter it or at least take it out of the tap a few hours early and let some of the chlorine evaporate. You know, chlorine is put into water precisely to kill bacteria, and you just need to think about that, you know, before you know, add your tap water directly into a jar where you're trying to cultivate bacteria.
Do you have a salt-loving cat? Maybe a kitten lapping it up at night? No.
Okay, back there. Okay, how rigorous am I about de-hulling beans for tempeh? Not very rigorous at all. So, okay, no, but let me just distinguish between two things. So, soybeans have this very heavy hull around each bean. And, you know, I mean, personally, I feel like that hull is very healthy. It's all fiber. I'm always trying to, like, you know, get more fiber in my diet. I would urge everybody to get more fiber in your diets. You know, you don't need to pick it all out, but you need for the hulls to slip off of the beans. If those hulls are so strong that if they remain on the beans, then there's no way the fungus that you're trying to grow, you know, to make it into tempeh is going to be able to penetrate into the beans and access the nutrients and bind the beans together. So I definitely do split the soybeans. I have a little, you know, a Corona mill, which is the, you know, very simple clamp-on Mexican-style mill for making masa, and you know, I wouldn't use it to like make you know, fine flour out of wheat. It would be very laborious, but if you set the plates a quarter-inch apart, it'll just almost effortlessly split each bean and the hulls will just fall off. Now, what I'm not rigorous about is I don't like spend a lot of time trying to get every hull out of there. I mean, when it first comes to a boil, I might skim the foam with whatever hulls have floated up to the top and get rid of them, but I just leave the rest of the hulls in. I mean, I definitely have watched people prepare tempeh who spend a half an hour picking every hull out, and I definitely don't do that. But you need to get them off of the beans, otherwise they will inhibit the growth of the fungus on the beans. Yeah, sure. So I mean, so most contemporary tempeh is made in plastic bags with little holes poked in them. So, you know, the plastic bag enables most of the moisture and humidity to be held in there, and the fungus likes a high level of moisture and requires a reasonable level of humidity, but it also needs some oxygen, so you can't have it completely enclosed in plastic. The little holes do that. That's not the traditional vessel at all. The traditional vessel is banana leaves. So I'm sure there are, you know, Southeast Asian markets around Portland where you could buy frozen banana leaves and, you know, and steam them, and you could use banana leaves, you could use some other kinds of leaves. And then also, if you have a humid environment where you're incubating it, tempeh requires a temperature roughly between 80 degrees Fahrenheit and 90 degrees Fahrenheit for about an hour, for about 24 hours. So most people's setups are fairly dry, but if you can do something that involves a humidifier, you can just do it in open trays. And then, I mean, it looks crazy because it grows these like long, you know, the mold grows these long hairs on it, but they just like dissolve when you cook the pieces of tempeh. So you can just do it in trays, or I mean, actually, in my book, I feature this a method used by this cafe I visited in Amsterdam where they made bowls out of tempeh. So they used these sort of like thinner little lentils to make you know, not such a fat bowl, but they just basically took hard plastic bowls that they reuse and drilled some little holes in them and created forms that way. So, you know, you can create other kinds of forms, or you can just do sort of open on a tray kind of thing, but you would want to have like a humidifier, or, you know, some kind of an incubation environment that stays, you know, really nice and humid. And then you don't need to have them wrapped like that. The other thing is to use banana leaves or other kinds of leaves, or, you know, probably you could figure out other, I mean, that's mostly how I've seen it done, but, you know, you could certainly figure out other kinds of wrappings. And by the way, if you do plastic bags and poke holes in them, you don't have to throw them, you don't have to do them as single use. You could just reuse the same bags. I've certainly, you know, sort of, I've done that. Yes?
What are your thoughts on the difference between cleanliness and sanitation when it comes to fermentation vessels?
Okay, this is a great question. What is the difference between, you know, cleanliness and sanitization? So, I mean, personally, I think for, you know, for home fermentation, for most processes, cleanliness is all you need. You know, soap and water are your friends, and like keeping your hands clean, keeping your tools clean, keeping your vessels clean. I mean, personally, I've come to the conclusion that, you know, all of these chemicals we can buy that will sterilize or sanitize are really just sort of exploiting our fear of bacteria. And you know, sure, there's all kinds of chemicals that you can buy that will sterilize or sanitize briefly. And then, you know, you'll rinse it with your non-sterile water, then you'll touch it with your non-sterile hands, you'll leave it in your non-sterile drying rack. And, you know, when we talk about environments that are like approaching, you know, sterility, like I'm sure in the university here, there's some laboratories, you know, where they have, you know, air filtration systems that cost thousands of dollars. And, you know, just in a casual home setting, it's really impossible to achieve that, and it's not necessary to achieve that. And I would say that, you know, there's more of a case to be made for using different kind of sanitizing chemicals if you're trying to do some single organism pure culture fermentation. So let's say you're making beer, where you're cooking your substrate before fermentation. With vegetables, like, you never have to add anything because it's on all the vegetables. I mean, that doesn't mean that there aren't people that will try to sell you a little white powder, a vegetable fermentation starter, but please don't buy it. There's no need for that. There's you know, even like, you know, industrial sauerkraut making, you know, Great Lakes Kraut, the largest kraut maker in the United States, does not use starter cultures. Like, there's just no need. They actually did research in the 1940s looking into using a starter of Lactobacillus plantarum, and their research led them to the conclusion that it produced an inferior product that didn't taste as good. So, you know, there's no need to do that. But, you know, if you're making beer, your wort, you know, after the brewing has just got the final step before fermentation is a boil. And so you're not going to have any, you know, indigenous yeast. Like, you know, if you just press apples into cider, if you squeeze grapes into juice to ferment that, you'll have a very easy spontaneous fermentation. But beer, you need some way of introducing the yeast. And I mean, you know, nowadays there are a lot of beautiful beers that are, you know, spontaneous beers or wild fermented beers, and those were just like the wort was left in some open tank with a broad surface, and just whatever's in the air in that environment is allowed to land on it. Typically people would never do that in summer. They would always do it in cooler weather, and it'll work better in some places than others, just depending on density of fruit trees, density of yeast in the air, or else, I mean, I have a friend who has a brewery in North Carolina, Fonta Flora, and he has one tank that he always saves a little bit in the bottom of the tank from the previous batch to backslop into the next batch. So he uses the previous batch as the starter for the next batch. But if you want to buy a particular strain of commercial yeast and get that to dominate, then, arguably the residue that could be in the tubes or in the fermentation vessel, could compete with that. So that's the only case where I would really think about using any kind of sanitizing chemicals. But if I'm working with any kind of mixed culture like this, I mean, I'll just make sure everything is clean with soap and water, and I think that's perfectly adequate, and I've never really experienced any problems.
And if anyone didn't get to try Sandor's Paltsai, there's some up here.
Well, that's my Paltsai, your Paltsai, and Heather's Paltsai.
Yeah, the sampler Paltsai platter.
Yeah. Try to make it a little louder. I'm having a hard time hearing you.
How would you respond to concerns about cultural sensitivity and reciprocity when using fermentation techniques that are
with fermentation techniques that
from your culture?
Yeah, no, I mean, I hear that. I mean, I have an insatiable curiosity. So the question is about cultural sensitivity and reciprocity. And, I certainly, try to be sensitive about that. I try to always credit the people that I learn from. But I also think that fermentation is part of everybody's traditions, and I think that there's thousands of years of cross-cultural pollination with fermentation. I couldn't tell you what culture mead comes from. There are traditions of mead that I've learned about on pretty much every continent that's inhabited. So I don't think all of these things have a single specific source, I just try to sort of learn from people who are showing me things and then sort of acknowledge what the source of the information is. I don't know. I mean, I think that, really, it can be a way of, sort of honoring different cultural traditions to sort of, make use of the, sort of the wisdom of them. But I also, I feel like I'm always listening, and I try to be really, certainly in my career of sharing information about fermentation, I have had people, criticize how I was representing a ferment that they had a more intimate connection with, and I feel like it's incumbent on someone doing the kinds of things that I'm doing to be open to hearing the criticisms and trying to represent other people's traditions in ways that they find to be respectful, and I'm always open to feedback.
And I feel like in fermentation journeys, a lot of the recipes, you've made a lot of these recipes and developed them as your own, like the special sauce with the natto, but a lot of the recipes are coming from Mrs. Ding's Paltsai, and then you have, you're honoring these people, sharing their stories, showing photos of them, and I loved, especially getting this book a couple months ago. I got an early copy, just feeling like I was able to travel with you. But I think that it's a lifetime of learning, and you're really sharing these. I mean, there's so many ferments in the book that I've never heard of, and that's helping to cross-culturally share. And I think it's an open book. It can be an open book right now because there's copies over there. But I don't feel there's no glossing over. This is a very detailed account of regions and recipes, and that's why I love it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Over there's another question. Can you a little bit louder? I mean, I don't worry about it much, but also, you know, I'm an avid gardener. Like, mostly I'm fermenting things from my own garden or, you know, other neighbors, you know, farms or gardens. So, you know, usually I'm working with, you know, things that come from people who I know and where I'm not that concerned about that. You know, honestly, I estimate at this point I've probably done 1,000 demonstrations like this, where, you know, just the organizers of the demonstration hand me whatever, and, you know, sometimes it's a Walmart bag, and you know, they just went to, you know, the biggest supermarket and you know, and bought the veggies. And you know, I've certainly never had any problems. It's not like, I mean, I would never source my vegetables in a place like that, but the fermentation still proceeds. Now, in terms of, you know, soil with heavy metals in them, I mean, I totally can see there's the potential for that, but it's not something that I have been concerned with or that tuned into, really. But I mean, I would just recommend that, you know, I mean, you know, something like this, you know, and you all live in the middle of a region with a lot of, you know, a lot of agriculture, a lot of vegetable production, and, you know, support local growers. And yeah, I mean, I think that you know, that's where you're going to get the best quality vegetables. And it's not that the fermentation won't work if you know, go to the supermarket and, you know, sort of buy something that you know, traveled a long way or sat in a refrigerated warehouse, but it'll be more vibrant if the vegetables are fresher. It'll be more delicious if the vegetables are fresher, and, you know, you can have more peace of mind if you have some idea of where they came from and how they were grown. Did you have a follow-up?
No, well, I was just talking more about things that are more concentrated, like using, you know, like a pound of turmeric.
Yeah, I see. I wouldn't usually use the powder. I would always use fresh turmeric. And, you know, a few years ago I learned that I could grow that where I live. So, and I understand that there are growers around this region who are growing turmeric. So, and in any case, I would use fresh turmeric rather than dried powder. You know, so I have a pickle in here that is not a traditional pickle, but this guy who I met in Tasmania, who has a little fermentation business, makes this beautiful paste out of turmeric, garlic, and turnips, and salt, and just enough water to blend it into a smooth paste. And I've had a paste like this going for a year. He's had it going for like 4 or 5 years now, and it's a perpetual brine like this. I keep on burying vegetables in, pulling them out. Periodically I'll add some more salt. This year I just, you know, after a year I added a little bit of more turmeric and garlic paste to it. You know, I would think that a pickle like that would only make sense if you know, can find a bunch of fresh turmeric, and I wouldn't try to do it with powdered turmeric.
Would you mind repeating a little bit of the questions that people are asking?
Yeah. I'm sorry. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, if there are any more. Okay.
I just love to hear you talk about
Koji. Yeah, sure. So, okay, how many of you have ever heard of koji? Okay, so koji is, so the question was, can you speak a little bit about koji? Koji is a Japanese name for rice, soybeans, barley, a range of substrates that you can grow with this particular fungus, Aspergillus oryzae. And usually koji is not eaten as a food in and of itself, but it's used because it has such an extraordinary richness of enzymes that it's used as a starter for other things. And the most widespread application of koji and its many relations all across the continent of Asia is for making alcohol out of rice. So, sake, miju, makgole, all the different variations of rice-based fermented alcohol rely upon koji to break down the complex carbohydrates of the starch into simple fermentable sugars, sort of analogous to malting in brewing, because the spontaneous fermentation of grains will generally yield acids rather than alcohol. So you have to convert the complex carbohydrates into simple sugars. Complex carbohydrates are long chain carbohydrates. Simple sugars are short chain carbohydrates, so you can break down the long chains into short chains. In the Asian tradition with koji, it's enzymes derived from this fungus Aspergillus oryzae. In the Western tradition of beer making, it's enzymes derived from germination of barley or other grains. That's what malting is simply germination. And then, the third way, which is really the first way because it's probably the most ancient way, there are legends in Japan that the first sake was made by young virgins chewing rice and then spitting it out. There's traditions in South America of people chewing corn. There's traditions in Africa of people chewing cassava. So our bodies produce enzymes that can do the same thing, and our salivary enzymes include amylase enzymes that can do this. So that's the other way to do that. So the most widespread application of koji is for making alcohol out of grains, and I thought that was confined to the Eastern Hemisphere until I went to Costa Rica, and my host in Costa Rica brought me to meet these indigenous Bree people on the Caribbean coast of Costa Rica, and they are growing molds on little cakes of corn and using that to make their chicha, their alcoholic beverage out of corn. So that was really interesting and eye-opening. And then since then, I've heard from an anthropologist working in Brazil who said that a lot of the Amazonian groups are using molds to break down cassava to make alcoholic beverages out of cassava. But then also there are all these protease enzymes that break down proteins. So miso and soy sauce use koji. And increasingly, experimental chefs it turns out you can grow koji on almost anything. I mean, yesterday at Fermenter restaurant here in Portland, we had beautiful beet charcuterie where they had grown koji enzyme on beets. I read about chefs who are growing koji on pork chops. I mean, you can grow koji on almost anything. I haven't been that wildly experimental, but I've grown koji on chestnuts, and almost any substrate you could grow koji on. It turns out, Anyway, if you had told me 20 years ago that I could fall in love with a mold, I would have just scoffed at that notion. But, koji is amazing. And when I grow koji, I walk into the kitchen the second morning, and it's like the whole kitchen has this beautiful sweet aroma. And it just, koji is miraculous. And, I'm so glad that more and more chefs are getting interested in it and finding new applications. I mean, you can make beautiful koji pickles. Those are the only pickles that get truly sweet. The koji, literally breaks down the complex carbohydrates of the vegetables and just makes them super sweet. So did you have a specific question about koji or?
No, just
yeah.
fellow fermentation.
So So here's like one interesting aspect of koji to me is that, we would say that like koji's Aspergillus oryzae, but until the 20th century nobody was using pure culture starters, and in most places across Asia they're making their koji-like starters using other methods than pure culture starters, and so usually it would include not only Aspergillus oryzae, but also Rhizopus, which is the tempeh fungus. And in the Chinese literature going back like 3,000 years, they were distinguishing, because bacteria nobody could ever see. Bacteria until microscopes would have been a purely like speculative idea, but molds begin microscopically. The spores are microscopic, the earliest growth you can't see with your eyes, but as it develops it becomes quite visible. And so Aspergillus, when it matures, when it sporulates, it turns this kind of like green yellow, almost like neon color. Whereas Rhizopus, when it sporulates, turns black. And so, in the Chinese literature, they were able to distinguish between, they called them like yellow-robed mold and white-robed mold. It wasn't until later that they got their names of Aspergillus and Rhizopus. But, it's really interesting to me that, like, they were distinguishing between them for thousands of years, and most of the traditions around Asia, like, the default is you end up with a mixture of the two of them. Yes?
What's your koji growing setup like?
So the question is, what's my koji? Yeah. So the question is, what is my koji making setup like? And I basically have a defunct refrigerator. I was buying another piece of kitchen equipment, and on the loading dock at the kitchen supply store, there was this sort of like old, beat up looking commercial refrigerator, and I was like, "What's the story with that?" They were, we're waiting for it to be hauled away. It's garbage. And then I was like, "Could I just take it while I have my truck here?" And they were like, "Sure." So I just brought home this like commercial refrigerator that didn't work. I took the compressor off of the top of it. I drilled a few extra holes in the bottom of it to have some good air circulation, and I put it on casters so I can wheel it into the kitchen or out onto my porch. And I just use like an incandescent light bulb, an old school light bulb, and then nowadays you can buy these great little temperature controllers for like less than $50. Inkbird is one brand. I've got some other brand that I got at a greenhouse supply store 15 years ago. But basically, the temperature controller plugs into the wall. The light bulb is in one of those like little clamp fixtures, and it plugs into the temperature controller, and then it has a sensor on it, and I set the temperature. So I usually will set it for 85 degrees Fahrenheit. And as soon as the temperature falls below 85, it turns on the light bulb, and as soon as the temperature reaches 85, it turns off the light bulb. So I just do it in a setup like that. And in the summer, I might leave it on my porch. In the winter, when it's cold outside, I'll bring it in the house so it's not the light bulb isn't having to generate that much heat. It's just marginal between the house temperature and the incubation temperature. And then, the early years when I did it in an oven with the pilot light on. I've seen people do it sometimes if you have an illuminating light that's warm enough. If you just put a thermometer in there, you might get up to your target temperature just with an illuminating light. I've seen people use heating pads that you would use for your sore back. I've seen people use those seed starting mats. You just need like a gentle source of heat. I've also seen people use a space heater in a spare bathroom or a closet or something like that. and honestly, you can do it, especially tempeh, you can do it at a lower temperature. Like I met this Indonesian couple in California with a tempeh business there, and they were just using a thermostat in a spare room to make the room 72, and they did it for 48 degrees at 72 rather than the traditional, 28 hours at 80 or 85. Yes?
I'm not affiliated with the mentor, but they sell a koji base there. Started get going with koji and play with it. He sells the base in like powder bites, containers.
Yeah.
It's really great on any vegetable.
Okay, and that's probably shio koji. So shio koji is this sort of like, contemporary application of koji where you mix koji and water and salt. Shio means salt in Japanese, salt koji. And you generally will ferment it like at ambient temperature for about 10 days to 2 weeks. And then depending on the salt content, either store it at ambient temperature or in the refrigerator. I usually use a lower salt content and store it in the refrigerator, but I meet people who do a higher salt content and never refrigerate it. But it's amazing because all those enzymes are still active. So if you marinate vegetables in it, or if you marinate a piece of fish in it, those enzymes are going to make the vegetables sweeter, make the fish more like savory and umami. So it just like the end. I mean, it's a seasoning, but it also is rich in these enzymes that if you give them some time, can really like make food more delicious. Okay, so I'm gonna take Liz's reminder, and I'm gonna turn off my Q&A speaking machine, and I invite people who didn't get some vegetables to come up and get a taste of vegetables, and then I'm gonna sit here, and if anyone wants me to sign a book that they buy here today, or a book that they brought with them that I wrote in the past, I'm happy to sign books. And if you have questions you're shy to ask in front of everybody, you can ask me questions there. But I thank you all for your interest and for coming today.
And I just want to say there's a fungus among us, because there are a lot of fermentation people out here. So there's Heidi from Wampaku Nato. And maybe just raise your hands, because there's so many makers here. Ernest and Yuri from Jurinji Miso, John from Squirrel and Crow, Sarah from Fermentista, anyone else? So it's really fun to have this community of makers, all of us here. So thanks everyone, and yeah, there's more poutsai if anyone didn't get any.
Okay, well thank you all.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank you, Heather, for making this happen, yeah.
Oh, okay, all right.